This is the moment we've all been waiting for the thousands in attendance and the millions watching around the world. Let's get ready to
Welcome to the Junkyard Pod. Today we have an episode of What's Next, a series where we focus on key players for the Cleveland Cavaliers and what we expect from them this summer and moving forward. Joining me today to discuss Darius Garland and where we go from here is a fellow DG loyalist, Justin Rowan of the Chasedown Pod. Thank you for being here. How have you been doing since the season ended?
Tony, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. It's exciting to be back on with you, talking about someone that I expected to take a leap this season, and I think there was a lot of circumstances that fed into it. But then I think there's also things with decision making and his play in general that it's still need to break down. But DG may not have made the leap this season, but I gotta give you some props, man. You absolutely did. Your work this season was amazing. I love the video breakdowns, everything you guys have been doing on the pod. It's really, it's an honor to be on with you. I really do appreciate it, and I think when we reflect back on the season, this is the time where you should give yourself a little bit of pat on the back, buddy.
Oh man, thank you so much. That truly does mean a lot. And you know what? You were the first podcast I did on Chasedown back in
That's
December
right.
2022, I think, the mailbag episode. So come a long way. Thank you so much. Honestly, that really does mean a lot. It's been one hell of a year. And so really do appreciate that. And I like to start each one of these episodes by just kind of recapping that season and summarizing very quickly where each player left off. So in the case of Darius, it was a wild one. I know the perception of DG is all over the place as a result of that, but Justin, how do you view this most recent season for Garland?
I view it as a lost season. I still think, when you look at a season where you come up short or lost season, however you want to characterize it, I still think there's stuff you can learn from it. And I know there's certainly things that I hope that DG is going to take away from this season and apply it moving forward. But it was just a season of false starts, basically. Um, you know, in the preseason game, I still remember the game against Atlanta where he's roaming around off ball. I think he took like 9 threes and a half, and then that
Yeah.
was kind of it. And then obviously having the hamstring pull, and unfortunately to start the year, DG, Donovan, and Karras all ended up having those hamstrings early on. He comes back, and I believe it was his first game back against Indiana, where he injured his shooting hand. And that seemed to disrupt not only his ability to dribble, but his willingness to take threes. I
Mhm.
believe there's a neck injury there at some point, and the jaw breaks, and it was just one thing after another. And it was an unfortunate season. I thought there were times where I saw things progressing into the right direction, whether that be the good finishing at the rim prior to the jaw being
Yeah.
fractured.
Mhm.
I thought you started to see some of that 3-point volume increase as you got a little more comfortable later in the year, but just never was able to stack positive momentum together. And for that reason, it just kind of feels like one of those lost years.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It was such a roller coaster. Every time you felt like he's back, it was immediately over.
Yeah.
There's those games against Minnesota. I think he had a big game against Philadelphia earlier in the
Yep.
season, and it's like so there were flashes there. I know a lot of people. I agree it's a lost season, but a lot of people think that he was just completely like just a ghost. He was gone all year. He had those little moments there where you could see that DG still is clearly talented. There's just a lot of factors at play.
The
Not
month
to,
before the jaw, honestly, like it was
yeah,
the last 15 games before the jaw, like the turnovers came back down as the
mhm,
hand injury became less of a factor. He was scoring, very efficiently, 22 points per game. The assists were there. Like he was putting that positive momentum together. It just, it didn't carry beyond those 15 games. And I brought this up on the last podcast, but it's funny for, as amazing as Donovan was this year and how many stretches he carried them, when you kind of look back at the best wins that the Cavs had this season, the funny thing about them is Donovan didn't play in any of them,
yeah.
right? Like
That win against Denver.
Denver, Minnesota, Dallas twice. One of those Dallas games, Darius and Mobley didn't play in it either, and they managed to win it
Oh
shorthanded.
yeah. Mm.
The Boston win, the win against Philadelphia that you mentioned in the in-season tournament, like the top 6 wins there were the guys finding a way to kind of contribute, and I think that's not a reflection on Donovan in any way, shape, or form. He was clearly the
Mm.
best player on the Cavs, but I think it just goes to show that we had a bunch of talented guys that were able to go out there and produce, but getting them all on the same page and all clicking at the right same time just seemed to be such a struggle compared to the year prior.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, just that never-ending carousel of injuries, even especially the ones where it's like hamstring or the shooting hand, where they're on the floor, so everyone just assumes that they're healthy, but
Right.
everyone on the Cavs was dealing with some sort of injuries. It just felt like they never were able to quite sync up everything that you wanted to see heading into the year with the addition of Max Strus and all that, thinking that this was going to be a more cohesive unit. There was just so much at play being juggled, and I think there's a delicate balance that needs to be handled with care, but Cavs Twitter's kind of just thrown Darius into the meat grinder and
He's
ignored
this
all of
year's
those
Allen.
disclaimers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's this year's Allen, right? Like
And
just
Allen's
last.
such a good example too, because how quickly things change.
Yeah, and Allen, that wasn't a health related thing, but you have a couple rough games, and all of a sudden people are sitting there trying to trade you for Christian Wood because he can shoot, right? Like
Yeah.
that's what it was last off season, and I think now you're seeing people throw out a bunch of fake trades for role players and stuff like that, like fine players, but like you don't win in the NBA by tearing down from all star caliber players to a bunch of role players, like
Mhm.
finding a Jay Crowder or George Hill isn't going to be what takes this team to the next level.
Yeah, you might be able to find a player that theoretically fits the team better, but if it's a
Right.
worse player, it's usually you just don't win those trades very often. And it's so rare. I mentioned this on my last pod too. You think about people want to move Darius and Jarrett this year. You're basically detonating everything that they built their foundations on. And it's just, I try to think back through NBA history. What teams have done that and improved as a result? It's really hard to, most teams don't even do that to begin with. But to trade two of your key pieces like that and immediately improve. I know someone mentioned the Celtics recently with getting rid of Marcus Smart, but they didn't change their foundations of success because you got a Jrue Holiday. You ended
Yeah.
up basically filling in that role. The Cavs aren't going to be trading Darius for another point guard, most likely. Everyone wants a wing, whether it's a star or even some role players, whatever it may be. So, yeah, I think making the team worse is usually not the goal, even if it looks like it makes more sense on paper.
Yeah, and in the instance of Marcus Smart, that was at the apex of value. That was
Mhm.
after an 8-year run of him in
Oh, yeah.
Boston, and I think that's different than hey, you had a down year because of injuries, and we're going to trade you while your value's at its lowest. Like, and then there's also the dynamics that they had where it was Jalen Brown or Marcus Smart, right? Like there was some
Mhm.
tension there reportedly, right? So, I think that this is a very different situation, and you know I wouldn't be surprised if there's some kinks that need to be worked out in terms of getting everybody involved, kind of harkening back to what I was talking about before of trying to get everybody on the same page and maximizing all the talent that you have available. But I think when it comes to the core and what to do with it this offseason, I think the team's obviously going to evaluate all options. But even if you've lost some confidence in the long term viability of the core, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to, go out right away, right? Like it's like folding when you have the option to check, right? Like you
Yeah.
you got to wait for the right opportunity here to see what's coming along. And if people are blowing your doors off with great offers, you're going to need to evaluate all of those. If everyone's coming in lowball because there's some notion that you have to make a decision, you can let it kind of play out a little bit. Let's see how it looks under a new coach. Let's see with some other pieces. We can make a evaluation in season at the trade deadline. Like there's a whole lot of options at the Cavs disposal, and I think people, they want immediacy. They want to see the microwave effect, and all right, let's just rebuild in a conventional way. And I don't care if we're losing talent in the process. That's not always the smartest way to go, and I it's not the way I expect the Cavs to go because they have operated with a lot of patience in the past.
Yeah, and I think that patience is always worth it. I mean, this is kind of where I'm at as far as the core goes. Like, yeah, if you can present me with the home run deal that just makes so much sense and it's an improvement, then of course. But I haven't really seen that become available. Obviously, I don't know what's out there for them, but uh, Cavs Twitter isn't very good with the trade machines. No one's fan base is very good with them. So
No.
it's either completely unrealistic or a deal that just doesn't make sense for the Cavs at all. So we'll have to wait and see. You could talk me into splitting up the core if it looks like it makes sense on paper, but I'm also glad that Kobe has shown some patience because there's no need right now to blow it up, especially, and I don't want to dive too deep into this, but if Mitchell extends, then there's really no need to go into doomsday mode and think that you have to shake it up because obviously it's dependent on if he gives any conditions, but if Mitchell extends to this core, then there's no need to blow it up. There's not that pressure anymore. So to kind of recap and finish my summary of Garland's season, then we'll move into our next topic. I think the reality is it's not an excuse to say that he broke his jaw and that all these other injuries played a role in it. I know people don't like to hear it, but it does factor into it. And above all else, I think we overlook how difficult this season was for everyone on the roster. We kind of hit on that, but Darius was not the only one with injuries who was struggling. One thing that I mentioned during the playoffs is that I'd like to see DG play with some second units that have a chance of scoring sometimes. He was just some of the units he had to lead. Throw in the fact that he's already having a difficult season, and then the units that he was being asked to carry, you got what you expected. Probably, it's just a heavy load for anyone who was already struggling. A stat that I pulled here: when you look back at the year, I think we all agree Mitchell and Allen were the two most reliable, steady contributors. Darius played 570 minutes next to those guys. That's less than a third of his total minutes. For context, they played 1,000 minutes together last season. So when you take him away from, especially someone like Darius, who is a guy who thrives by getting his teammates going, and you take him away from his best teammates for most of the season, I think it's to be expected. And to put a bow on all this, of course, none of the excuses an underwhelming season. I expected a leap from him. I was hoping to see, I thought he could have a borderline all NBA jump in him at best. So, of course, I'm disappointed as anyone. But again, it's a delicate balance. You can't just hammer him for all these flaws without thinking deeper about why it may have happened.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that's a great stat. I didn't realize that it was less than a third of his minutes, and I think in the past, as much as Donovan's been the best player on the team these last 2 years, Darius has been the guy, particularly last season, where he elevated lineups more than anybody else, right? Like they had in 22-23, they had the second best offense in the league with him on the court, and they had the 29th with them off, right? Like it was the largest on court, off court impact on the team by a pretty wide margin. And he's someone that elevated a lot of kind of questionable lineups, particularly the two man pairing with him and Evan Mobley. You were able to just kind of
Mhm.
put anybody out there, and those lineups were able to be effective. And that's something you can do when someone's in a rhythm, when he's having the best season of his career as he did that first year with Donovan Mitchell. Like you can do that. But when a guy's in a funk and he's trying to find his rhythm, and okay, you're throwing him out there, with George Niang a lot in those first minutes when he came back, and other
Mhm.
guys that were trying to find their own games as well, with not a lot of roster continuity, it's going to lead to some shaky results. But I do think it's important, we've got the context out of the way. I do think that it's important to still kind of dive into what went wrong, what takeaways, where those opportunities for improvement are possible. What areas there are possible in, I should say.
Yeah, and you set me up perfectly for our transition to our next topic because now that we've made all the excuses, let's focus on some of the real limitations to his game that showed up throughout the year and how he can improve on them. I think we all assume that a full summer to recover and shake off those struggles will naturally allow him to bounce back, and I certainly believe that, but there's also some issues that could carry forward. I think of limitations such as getting to the basket, especially getting to the free throw line, his tendency to kind of fall by the wayside when Mitchell is taking over. And basically, I just wonder, can he not only return to form, but are there things that he can even improve on for next season? And so, what are you expecting to see from Darius?
I, you know, that word expecting is tough because,
Mm,
even as one of Darius's biggest believers, like, I'm kind of in a wait and see mode because what he needs to do as a player is nothing that we haven't seen him do before. It's just about putting it together consistently, right? Like the fact that he came into the season a whole lot stronger, he was getting to the line at a good clip. He was finishing at the rim at a career best rate, and that had been a real kind of area of growth. But the funny thing about that stretch was his hesitancy to take threes, and I think that was tied to the hand,
Mm.
ability to grip the ball, and just it impacted his shooting as well. But he was almost leaning on it too much, where he's kind of you getting into a little bit of grifting mode, and that kind of play, especially with an improved build but still a slight frame, you're kind of asking to get banged up. You're kind of asking for
Mm.
some injuries there. So what I want to see is more efficiency with his decision making. I think that's where I really want to see improvements because, in general, when you look historically, usually someone that does a good job taking care of the basketball. The first year with Mitchell, only Nikola Jokic had a better assist to turnover ratio among high usage players. But even in that season, you would still see kind of those careless passes where he's coming up the court at a low pace and he's kind of throwing, those sideline out passes at half speed that get picked off and go the other direction. You got to cut those out. You got to be more efficient with your decision making, recognizing what the defense is giving you and taking advantage of that, I think is really, really important. One of the things I loved about that Boston game, the one at home where, they almost stole that one, was he was taking some of those mid-range pull-ups. He was taking what was available to him, and he's got to recognize when he can pull from three, when the shooting pocket is coming off of that screen and taking a 18-footer in rhythm. And once he starts taking what the defense is giving him and punishing them in those spots, all of a sudden that's going to open up those opportunities at the rim, right? Like you hope that he, as he gets his strength back and kind of gets back to a form where he's finishing at the rim at a decent level, you hope that, okay, now that the defense is second guessing, it's going to make it a little harder for them to defend. Whereas if you're just taking threes, or if I'm driving to the basket, I'm either going to loop around or I'm going to go for a layup attempt. That becomes a whole lot easier for shot blockers and defenders to time out. So I think, just a little bit more patient and be more efficient with his movements and what he's doing on the court would be really, really helpful.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. I think to a degree, he's become a little too predictable with his
Yes.
game at times. And I think we saw the big picture of what you want his game to look like. It just happened throughout different spurts of the year. It was like broken apart. At the start of the year, he's finishing at a career high rate, but it was the most sloppy turnovers I think we've seen from him. They were just
Terrible.
inexplicable,
Yep.
a lot of those, and he wasn't shooting the three. And then when he comes back from the jaw injury, he cleans up the turnovers. He starts shooting the lights out. But of course, I wish I could remember the stat because I tweeted it, but he was like slightly above average finishing at the rim before the jaw injury, and he plummeted to, I think, like second worst out of 300, 400 players. It was just complete fall off a cliff. And clearly the jaw had an effect on that, but he wasn't a very strong finisher at the rim to begin with because of his slight frame. And then obviously a lot of things were working against him. So if he's able to put all that together where you are getting the 3-point shots, you're getting aggressive drives to the rim, do a little bit of the foul grifting, but not too much because he doesn't seem to get the greatest whistle, and get to the free throw line, which he was trending upwards 2 years in a row, getting to the free throw line at a better rate. Those are easy points, obviously being left off the board, and just picking and choosing the right shots, taking that mid-range pull-up at times. I think another thing he did when it comes to getting to the rim is he would just assume that the defender is going to come over and try and contest his shot. And so he throws the lob when the floater or the layup was there. And we saw some weird turnovers with that, or just putting Mobley in awkward positions where he's catching dump off passes that should have been layups. And so little things like that he can clean up. And I do think it's kind of a snowball effect of where it was just a brutal season for him. And I think he started to question himself at times and be a little hesitant. So I'm hoping for a full bounce back. I think honestly, having some success in the playoffs and then having this season cut short because of injuries, I think it'll light a fire in all of the Cavs more than last year's collapse did, because that's the kind of heartbreak where you lost to the team that very well might win the championship here. And the Cavs have every reason to believe that they could have taken Boston out had they been healthy. They were right in it. And so I think that'll inspire them, especially Garland, where I think he'll be working his ass off to get to that next level.
Yeah, absolutely. And It's funny. The Cavs actually had in their series against Boston, they had a better offensive rating than Dallas has had so far, which, considering the guys they had missing and with everything that they were playing through, that's a little bit surprising. But yeah, you hope that, there's positive takeaways from it, right? Like I think there's a lot of actionable data there. And, in general, I still say that I liked what the Cavs ran offensively. It's just the frequency with which they ran it. Guys understanding and buy-in in terms of playing off ball, and also just kind of how predictable it was at times. Like
Mhm.
I think it's an offense that needs like a little bit more seasoning, right? Like you just need to disguise things a little bit more, be a little quicker, a little more decisive. Like that's something that Darius need to improve with, but I think it's true of the offense overall. And I think that this is a group that really would benefit from more structure rather than the read and react. Like I think that there is, still meat on the bone. There's things left to be discovered with what this group can do offensively. And the funny thing is, like, when you look at the pairing of Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland over the last 2 years, I don't think it's a coincidence that Mitchell's had his best 2 years of his career playing alongside Darius. I know he's credited him in the past and credited the situation in Cleveland for helping bring out the best in him. But when you look at the playoffs, when it hasn't worked well, it's been on the offensive end. Like everyone's questions about, small backcourt, how's this going to work?
Mhm.
It doesn't
Yeah.
translate to the playoffs and all that. It translates to the playoffs. The defense is still elite. In
Yeah, it's
fact,
been fine.
it improves with both guards on the court in the postseason compared to the regular season elite number. If you have just Evan Mobley out there, because that's the other thing. Oh, well, they got the two bigs, protecting for them. It's a 105 defensive rating with just the two guards and Evan Mobley and no Jarrett Allen. Like that is a lineup that works. It's just that the offense hasn't been up to that standard. And,
Mhm.
because the offense hasn't been there and because it has like felt so difficult to go out there and score points, other teams, when they kind of hit those baskets down the stretch and whatnot, it feels like, oh man, we can't get a stop when we need one. And that
Yeah.
clouds the perception of the defense. When you look overall, the defense is doing a very good job in those situations. So the fact that, the shortcomings are on the offensive end of the floor gives me some confidence that, hey, there's a way to kind of structure this better to lessen the load on those two guards, because they're really what they're asked to do offensively is pretty steep at times. I just think that, again, that there's meat on the bone and there's ways to make things click a little bit easier than they have. But in general, man, like playoff scoring is hard. It's
Mm.
difficult. It happens to the best. Kyrie has shot like crap these two games, man.
Yeah.
Like this stuff happens. And when you only have like 4 or 5 games in a series, right? These kind of abbreviated series against teams that are uh, either better than you or playing better than you, like 1 or 2 games where you just don't shoot well, all of a sudden, like if there's not a larger sample size, people are, or even if there is a larger sample size, really, people go, yeah, not made for the playoffs, and not that
Oh,
type
it
of
drives me
performer.
crazy.
When in reality, man, like this happens to almost everybody, and it's just we have an unfair standard when it comes to LeBron James and the expectations that the greatest player of all time has put on this organization, and even then, he got locked up by JJ Barea. Like these things happen, man.
It happens, man. Yeah, no, I love that I love every point you just made right there, because I mean, we just saw the Miami Heat. Perfect example of you get hot at the right time and things can happen for you in the playoffs. Minnesota beating Denver. Anthony Edwards just catches fire at the right time. And then of course goes cold in the next series. I think
Yep.
we've seen this with
Not a
Tatum.
playoff performer, man. Not a
Yeah,
playoff performer.
it's just the narrative should not shift that quickly off of
Right.
one performance. And you see it with Tatum every night too. It's just people are very quick to overreact. And the Cavs, unfortunately, like, I'm so glad you mentioned the defense, because that it just drives me crazy, because just I hate to say this, but just watch the games. There are so many
Mhm.
people who still point towards this backcourt pairing saying it can't work because they can't play defense. Have we watched the last 2 seasons? They're fine defensively. That has
Yeah.
not been their problem. Even against Boston, where I know Mitchell got injured, so we didn't see it for a full series, but that was where I was most concerned is, hey, they have two guys who Boston can really pick on. It really wasn't that much of a problem. It wasn't ideal, but they didn't lose because they couldn't play defense. They lost because they couldn't score enough points.
Yeah, like at some point the results matter, right? Like people say, oh, like targeting Darius or targeting Donovan. Like the first two games, they definitely targeted Darius, then they targeted Donovan a ton in game three. Like, yes, that's going to happen, but the defense overall held up well. And in general, yeah, that's how offenses in the NBA work. Like you're going to
Yeah.
have whoever is on a primary initiator, which is usually one of those guard spots, they are going to be involved in the primary defensive action because they are guarding the primary initiators on the other team. Like that's how this works, man.
Mm,
Like, and at the end of the day, like I said, results matter. And the reality is the offensive results haven't been there in the postseason. There is no magical combination of the guys currently on our roster that's performed at a very high level in the playoffs offensively. Like it doesn't matter if it's one big or if it's two bigs, if it's one guard or two guards. Like it just hasn't been at the level that it needs to. And I think the offensive talent on this team is good enough to go out there and do it. So, whether that's structure, whether that's tweaks to the the rotation guys or whatever the case may be, I just think that there's a lot of avenues to explore. But it's worth noting that while like I said, you may have doubts about the long term viability of this group. You're still starting at a really good place, man. Like the
mm,
baseline of what this Cavs team is able to accomplish, and like the number of wins they got in just a ridiculously injured raveled year. Like, man, it. I know there's a sense of urgency, and there should be, but we're in a pretty good place as Cavs fans.
yeah. And that's the important thing with the defense, too, is if the defense looked horrible, if it was Dame and CJ level, then there would be some urgency to say, hey, I don't know if this is going to work. Because you just don't expect Darius or Donovan to be able to improve that much on defense to make it work, but they're good. I think you can expect them to improve offensively. Now, whether or not you feel comfortable banking on that, it's up for anyone's personal opinion. But if it was the defense that was the issue, we would all be saying, all right, it's time to break them up. The fact that the defense has been fine and the offense just needs some tweaking, it's really easy to talk yourself back into it, I think.
Yeah, and defense is honestly one of the areas where I was most disappointed with Darius, just because I understand the 3-point shooting when you got a hand injury and everything that was going on. Like I understand some inefficiencies in his offensive game as he goes through it, but what we saw in his first year with Mitchell was a major step up defensively. Like I thought that he played as good positional defense as we've seen from him, and this year was a step back
Mm,
in terms of EPM. He was still 51st percentile, so very much middle of the pack. It's not terrible, but the year prior, he was just so much more effective defensively, and even at times this year, like I thought we saw him defend well in spurts. It's just the
mm,
the attention to detail and the focus wasn't consistently there. Just looked it
mm.
up. The year prior, 2023, he was 79th percentile defensively in terms of EPM. Like I thought, I know he didn't make the All Star team in that season. I think some of that was because he missed time early in the year with the eye injury, and it was just kind of a games miss thing. That was the best year of his career. He was the most
Agree.
he is
Yep.
the most efficient year as a scorer. He scored at the exact same rate as the All Star year. His defense took a major leap. As I mentioned, the assist to turnover ratio was elite. Like he was doing it on every single level. And I thought even his off ball play made some steps in the right direction. It still wasn't where I wanted to see it, but it made steps in the right direction. I thought his play off ball and his play defensively both took a step back this year. And that to me is more of a focus and effort thing, right? Like I understand you're playing through some stuff and your confidence may not be there, but still make those hard cuts, right? Instead of the
Mm,
the kind of half-assed cuts
yeah.
that aren't going to draw the attention of a playmaker. Commit on the defensive end and say, all right, I'm uneven offensively, but I'm at least going to consistently lock in on the defensive end. Like those are the areas where it's understandable, but still, when you have all NBA and all star expectations of yourself, those are the areas that you have to be a little bit more consistent.
Yeah. I mean, those are the tiny areas of his game that if he polishes, and I think we've seen the potential to do so, that's how you make that leap.
Yeah.
I agree so much on the defense. I thought last year he was so much better on defense than I think he ever got credit for. This year, that was a disappointing part of the second half of the season, especially where it just felt like completely checked out on that end. I know the season was grueling. I will say I thought he played pretty well defensively in the Orlando series. Of course, they're not a super high powered offense to really pick on him, but I thought he had stretches in that series where it felt like last year's DG again, but that's an area where he can look to return to form, I guess. And I think this is a good way to transition to, listen, there's that potential trade request that is looming over everyone's head as we count down to the offseason. But I want to focus less on that report or any potential trade ideas and just really start with, if the Cavs bring Darius and Donovan back, what needs to happen for Garland to reach his ceiling? I think improving on defense or just putting in that effort on defense is a huge focus. And honestly, he has been trending upward as an interior scorer before the injury. And the off-ball movement is something that everyone has been waiting to see, and I think we've seen glimpses of it. His usage rate went his usage rate went down this year. His touches went down, and I think he tried to fill a role next to Mitchell off the ball, but it's a new challenge for him. I've said this before, but handling the ball is what made Darius a star. Learning to play without it is what will make him a complete player, and maybe a new coach will help maximize that potential.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think he needs to be more assertive with the possessions that he does get, whether that's pulling from three, as I mentioned, kind of recognizing those mid-range shooting pockets. And I think, you know, becoming a consistently viable threat. Well, he's a viable threat from there, but just not turning down those opportunities. I really think it's going to open up those opportunities on the inside, because he's looking to, get into kind of get into the paint, create assist opportunities for Mobley or Allen. Sometimes do the floater. I thought he got away from the floater a little bit too much this past season. But like, that's kind of what his primary motivation is. That's where he's naturally kind of geared towards. And I just think, pulling from three a little bit more, pulling from mid range a little bit more is going to keep the defense guessing. And that's going to increase the finishing at the rim. Like, I think, as much as we talk about the strength and what we saw earlier in the season, I didn't love his shot diet and the way that he was getting to the rim, even though the results were good. I just thought he was forcing it a little bit too much, and kind of putting an unnecessary physical burden on himself. So obviously, cutting out the careless turnovers and committing on defense, I think that's going to be a big difference. But just becoming less predictable as an offensive player, he's so effective already with the way that he is playing, that just kind of ironing that out, I think, makes a big difference. And I want to see him as a primary initiator in this offense. I think that's when Cleveland's at its best. Looking at, Rich Paul's comments, and listening to Chris Haynes talk about it as well on his podcast, like, that seems to be what kind of any like disgruntlement or whatever has been about. And Brian Windhorst has said there's been nothing from DG or his camp about being unhappy in Cleveland or anything like that. But Rich's comments seemed to me, when I was reading them, to be about role, right? Like, hey, we saw what happened in the playoffs, where he's basically kind of being used as an off-ball shooter, and Mitchell was the primary initiator. Like, let's find a better balance. Let's find a healthier balance. I thought the balance, honestly, against the Knicks was really good. They were basically even in touches, and it went away from it this year, right? And there's some chicken and egg there in terms of, hey, he's not playing as well, he's not playing as confident, so he's going to get fewer touches. But I think not only for his ability to get Evan Mobley going, which is obviously one of the most important things when you talk about lifting the ceiling of this team, but also just in preserving Donovan, right? Like, Mitchell, you listen to some of the reporting and whatnot, talking about his minutes, like, he's 19th in minutes per game. Like, if his body was breaking down after, a 13 game stretch where they really didn't play a lot of games because of that Paris trip, like, they had a lot of time off, but, his body broke down after that time as a primary initiator. And, nobody on this team, like, sometimes we get so hyper focused on our team and what's going on that we don't kind of check those trends around the league. Like, Mitchell's 19th in minutes per game. I think Darius was 51st. Strus and Allen were in the 70s. Mobley was in the 80s. Like, These
Yeah.
guys aren't playing a ton, man. Like, if you think, oh, well, JB was running them to the ground like Tibbs and new coach is going to change things, there's a very good chance that a new coach is actually going to play these guys more minutes because our starters were not playing a lot of minutes. The biggest difference between the Cavs and a lot of other teams when you talk about the size of the rotation is that we had 3 guys coming off the bench that play a lot of minutes, right? Like Karis LeVert's getting his 28, Isaac's getting 26, George was getting his 24, and you might have another guy get 10 or 12. The teams that go 9 or 10 deep, they have a bunch of bench guys that maybe play 10 to 15 minutes per
Mm.
game, right? Like you don't have those guys playing like true 6-man minutes where the Cavs basically have 3 of them. So I think Darius shouldering an offensive burden, getting Evan Mobley going, and making sure that Donovan Mitchell is fresh for those moments that you need it the most. Like, to me, that's the most important thing.
Mm. Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And, I see the people who say, oh, it's what, 2, 3 years in a row of the Cavs crumbling due to injury down the stretch of the year. It's because they're being ran into the ground, and they're really not. None of these guys have played super heavy minutes, at least compared to the other best teams in the league. I couldn't tell you why they end up getting injured. It just,
Dude,
sometimes just happens, man.
here's the thing, man. Like, we're both Cavs optimists. That is not an optimistic slant. Like, really, like I think a lot of people are actually more optimistic than me when they're like, hey, new coach, it's going to make everything better. They're not going to play these heavy minutes and whatnot. They're not playing heavy minutes, man. Like, it's not an encouraging sign. Like, it's, maybe there's something to do behind the scenes outside of like the games that we're not seeing in terms of like approach or practice and how they handle things in training camp, that might change. But in terms of games, man, like, they're not playing a ton. It's not really a concern for me at all. Like, if you want kind of an easy answer for why things have fallen apart and why guys got banged up, like, it's not really there.
It happened to every team, by the way. Like, it's the
Yeah.
Cavs are by far not the only team that dealt with injuries this year. So I think that's important to note too. Yeah, I mean, to kind of round out this segment, I think we have seen the glimpses of what will make Darius a complete player. Trying to be optimistic, maybe a new coach will help structure the offense because, and this is actually a good way to transition to what it would mean if the Cavs lost DG this season if they traded him, because the your turn, my turn stuff with Mitchell gets very heavily criticized, and I get it. But at the same time, the people who want Donovan to be the lead point guard, this heliocentric stuff doesn't work in the NBA. You kind of need a little bit of your turn, my turn at the highest stage where even the Celtics, Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, they get criticized for that. But as long as you have a supporting cast that can help support you, it works. The heliocentric stuff just never does. And so that's why I think the Donovan Darius pairing still has so much untapped potential, because there is a degree of, hey, we have 2 guys who can dice you up on any given possession. And if we learn how to balance them off each other and not have these games where it's Darius playing off ball entirely and Donovan's running the show, or hey, Darius is hot tonight, so he's going to fill it up from the 3-point line. If they find a way to truly bounce off each other, and I think we have seen the moments where that happens. Game 2 against the Knicks last year, it's a great example. Donovan's rolling and he starts getting deep, or Darius is rolling and Donovan's looking for him. Like, I think there's so much potential there. I know you'll love this because these people will say the Cavs unlocked something this year without DG, the 18-2 stretch. That just, it's not a real thing that happened. They didn't go 18-2 without DG. I'm sure you know the number off the top of your head, but I think it was
Yeah.
9-1 with once DG came back, right?
Yeah, it was 9-1 with Mobley. Well, counting the one that Mobley played on his own against the Clippers, it was 9-1, and the offense actually improved. And the funny thing with that stretch with just Donovan and Jarrett was people are like, oh, now they're playing super up tempo. No, they actually slowed down. Like,
Yeah.
their decision making was more decisive. But their highest paced player prior to the jaw injury was Darius, right? Like, they played, and when they Mobley and Garland came back, the starting unit actually played a lot quicker. I thought that was a really smart thing with JB understanding, hey, we don't have a lot of as much spacing with this lineup, so we're going to play up tempo with our starters. But yeah, they went in the games where it was just Mitchell and Allen. It got broken up a little bit because there was that 3-1 stretch without Mitchell, Garland, and Mobley. But they went 11-3. They only played 3 games against teams that were above 500, which was the 2 against the Bucks and 1 against Orlando. And Milwaukee had just fired their coach, and they went below 500 after that. So like, it's not like that was a, looking back on the season, I think there's certain losses and wins that looked better than they did in real time. Like everyone freaked out early in the year about losing to the Thunder when we were down two of our starters. Like that doesn't look as bad. The Bucks win does not look as good as it did. Like that was not a good team at any point after that stretch. So, I think that keeping that in mind, like, yes, there were positives from it, but I think you also have to look at everybody got wear and tear injuries from that stretch, from the increased load that they were shouldering over that time against losing teams, not playing a lot of minutes. Donovan's knee gave out, Max's knee gave out, Karas's knee gave out, Wade's knee gave out. Like they just weren't able to kind of handle that physical load. And I think you saw in the playoffs too, where Donovan was functioning as the point guard when he's playing against really good teams and really good defenses. The balance between playmaking and scoring gets skewed. Kai shot 60% off of Donovan Mitchell passes in the playoffs. So it's not like he was setting guys up and they were bricking everything. He shot 60%. The problem is if they shot 100% in the playoffs, he still wouldn't have averaged 8 assists per game. Like the playmaking just completely went out the window where there weren't even those playmaking attempts. And, I think that's why you saw those last two games against Boston, like everyone was like, oh, look, no Jarrett Allen. That's why Evan Mobley had these 2 good games. Jarrett had been out for a while. Mobley struggled those last 3 games offensively against Orlando without Jarrett. He struggled kind of earlier in that Boston series. And I think playing alongside DG and having him be the primary point guard, one game where Garland scored well and another where he just wasn't efficient at all. But just the playmaking and the chemistry with Mobley, I think really kind of helped get him going. And I made this analogy on the chase down, but this isn't a, hey, Donovan's making them worse kind of take, which I think people could, if they had bad motivations, they could take that angle. It's more like when you're cooking or baking where, hey, we had a little bit too much salt. I love salt. It makes everything taste better. We got to find the right balance, right? Like just because you had a little bit too much of one ingredient and it took away from some of the other ingredients doesn't mean you take it out of the recipe entirely. And I think finding that right balance between the two as playmakers, because Donovan did take a step forward as a playmaker, is going to be important. But like you said, man, I've hated heliocentric offenses. I didn't like it when Luka ran it, and Mavs felt the same way, and they went out and got Kyrie, right? The Hawks did it with Trae Young. They went and got DeJounte because they said, hey, this doesn't work. Russell Westbrook, I didn't like the kind of martyr ball that he was playing with the Thunder. I don't want that to be what the Cavs play, and I don't think Donovan's as good of a playmaker as Russell Westbrook is, right? Like, so it's at the end of the day, man, like I just, if you were to move on from Darius, I think you would need to be getting either, some sort of kind of replacement point guard, kind of in a George Hill mold that's just going to, kind of take care of business and get people into their spots. Or the other way that you could build off of this is Donovan in kind of a Jamal Murray role, which, you need a Jokic to make it work. You need to have, if we're going to make the comparison to Kyrie, you need to have a Luka Doncic or LeBron James. And those type of front court playmakers that can act as a primary initiator are not the easiest thing to acquire.
Yeah, I just think this season was such a perfect storm for anyone who has bad motivations to just cherry pick whatever stretch, whatever segment of the year that helps support their narrative. Really, it was just such a mixed assortment of results this year that everyone is right and no one's wrong. And there's so many different ways you could take this season. Really, there's just so much nuance that you have to be honest with yourself. And I think overall, people just overlook how DG at his best is still hugely impactful for the Cavs and how difficult it would be to replace that. I know a lot, like I love Craig Porter Jr. He's not ready to be the starting point guard, guys. I've seen that on Twitter. It's just, we have fallen very low on what DG offers you. When he's at his best, he is a top 5, maybe top 10 floor general in the whole NBA. When he's being that efficient game manager, it's just so hard to replace what he brings. And if you don't have that, now you're relying entirely on Mitchell to do all of those little things that Garland does to manage a game on top of being the volume scorer. And while I think Mitchell improved a lot as a playmaker, I don't feel comfortable relying on him to be the full-time point guard. He's a great volume scorer. He has one of the lowest assists to usage ratios in the NBA. And
Mhm.
heliocentric teams, when they attempt to have that volume scorer also be the point guard, it just doesn't work out, especially when that guy is under 6'3". Again, the your turn, my turn play style, it has value in the NBA. There's just a balance that you have to strike. Even LeBron and Kyrie, there was a balance that they found. Now, very, very different players. Amazing. I mean, you have LeBron on your team. It's a lot easier to make stuff like that work. But again, I think you just can't overlook what DG brings. And the thing that scares me the most is that if you trade Darius this season, you're going to end up trial and error, finding your way back to we need a traditional point guard next to Mitchell. And it might not be as easy to get that as people think.
Mhm. No, I totally agree, and it's funny because, everybody's solution to fix a rotation and to fix a team is always just play whoever isn't playing. But like you look at it, man, and like from the end of January on, basically like that January 27th game where Mobley came back, and honestly the trend started prior to that. But you look at like the last 4 months of the season, the most harmful players from an on-off standpoint were the guys everyone was calling for. It was Sam
Yeah.
Merrill, it was Marcus Morris, it was all these guys that Craig Porter Jr., like all the
Yep.
guys that were the easy fixes. It just didn't work. And in the instance of Craig and Sam, I think as scouting reports caught up to them and they needed to kind of add those other dimensions to the game. They became a little less effective, but I think that's important for them moving forward, right? Like that gives you
Mhm.
actionable data for the offseason. And I still really like what Craig can be as a backup point guard in the future. And honestly, I still believe in Ty Jerome. I think that was a great signing. It's a 6'5" point guard that shoots well and never turns the basketball over. In theory, that would have been a
Yeah.
perfect third guard to stagger Garland and Mitchell. And
Mhm.
I think you want to talk about like, hey, they didn't play a ton of injuries, or minutes in, but they still got injured. I think the way that the Cavs have just gone depleted at a single position so frequently ends up
Yeah.
contributing to it, right? Because you just like all the injuries hit almost at the same time where, hey, we're down our second and third string point guard. So we're just going to have to play one guy a ton of minutes or at least give them a ton of responsibility in the minutes that they do have. And that just leads to more wear and tear. And it's a cyclical thing. I think that's why the teams that end up getting injured, like there's almost that compounding effect of it. So when you have Ricky on leave and Ty gets hurt and
Yeah.
then Darius is out to start the year, like man, and Mitchell's already playing through a hamstring injury, like it was a tough season, and I just hope everybody has a great off season and gets a lot of yoga, a lot of massages, and everything that they need to be fresh for next year.
Yeah, no, I hope so too, man, because injuries just really derailed any potential momentum they could have built. Kind of bringing this full circle to what I said earlier. If the Cavs keep this core together, they're going to need to explore every avenue to carving out a stronger supporting cast. Because really, the thing for me is they just need some stability on the bench. They have too many lineups or guys who, and I love Karis LeVert, but bad Karis is very bad. And if you
Yeah,
just had more guys where even when they aren't making shots, they're not a net negative, they aren't tanking lineups, I think that would go a long way towards providing stability to this core and helping Darius Garland in times where he's not playing well because he's not going to share the floor with Mitchell for 48 minutes. That's an
no,
aspect of this that people leave out is that Darius, he struggled the most. His net rating dipped the most when he wasn't next to Mitchell, which directly contradicts the idea that this backcourt can't coexist. Both of them had their best ratings when they were together overall, I think. And so what do I know, right? Apparently these guys it's a horrible fit and they can't play next to each other, but for some reason they're at their best when they're together. Mitchell has had his two best seasons of his career. I know this year Darius was out for much of that stretch, but Darius had the best year of his career last year, and I just think we overlook that too easily.
yeah, and honestly, I think Mitchell was better overall the year prior. Like I just think
Yeah,
from
overall.
an efficiency standpoint and whatnot, I thought it was a better year from him. He did have those good couple weeks and whatnot, but I think
Mm,
on the whole, and honestly, I think from Mitchell's case, it's injuries as well. Like the hamstring to start the year, him playing as a primary initiator. I kind of remember, but before Darius got back and kind of found a rhythm there, Carter and I were talking about, hey, like looking at Mitchell's data for his career, like it just doesn't work when he's not next to a point guard, and that's probably
Yeah.
part of the Cavs struggles here. But he was injured to start the year. He had that good stretch, and then after the All-Star break, we never saw him healthy. Like I just think
Mm.
the body work the year prior was just so much better from Mitchell's standpoint. But you're right, man. Like there's this perception that these guys are out there 48 minutes together when that's just not the case. Like Mobley has played over the last 2 years almost as many possessions on his own as he has with Jarrett Allen. The same thing goes for Garland. Like his possessions with Mitchell are almost equal to his minutes on his own. Like it's just they've done a good job staggering over the last couple of years, and the perceptions that people have of, oh, we're just kind of running this unconventional lineup out there for so long, like it just doesn't match reality. It doesn't match any of the data.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. Listen, there's opportunities there for this core four to really reach their ceiling all together. And I know some people are going to be pissed if they don't make any moves this year. But I see the potential. I really do. And I don't want to put too much stock into what a new coach could bring, because I think a lot of this comes down to the players themselves improving
Agreed.
and buying in and making changes on their own. But maybe a fresh take, maybe, I think again, the fact that they were so close this year, I know they lost in 5, but it felt like they were right there to the team that ultimately might win the championship. I think that's going to make them a little more motivated than, of course, just getting stomped by the Knicks. That motivates you in a different way, but being right on the doorstep and feeling like if we can just polish these aspects of our game, we can really do it. I think that's going to get them fired up.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's a lot of actionable data there, and the fact that it took Boston getting like 30 more free throws to beat Justin Garland and Mobley in one of those games. Like just little stuff like that. I think there was enough to say, hey, we can just get there, man. Like we're right there. I think the biggest takeaway from this year is that there is no 2017 Warriors. Like there's no team that's just
Mm,
lapping the field. I think there's a ton of parity, and it's going to come down to matchup. It's going to come down to who's playing the best at the right time. It's going to come down to who's healthiest and getting some breaks. In an NBA like that, man, like you can talk yourself into, all right, you know, more structure with the offense, so everybody's being maximized in a different way, getting that buy-in, internal growth, guys getting closer to their prime. Like Mobley's still 3-4 years away from his peak, in my opinion, or
mm,
like the start of his prime. Garland's
yeah.
probably 2-3 years away from the start of his prime, because historically guys start to hit that around 27. We're still a
Mm,
ways away with these guys, and I think the expectations have shifted because of what we've seen from them. Like they've earned it. They've earned an increase in
yeah.
expectations, but I think that still does have to come with a little bit of understanding that, hey, like these things do take time. They do, like, needs to marinate. It needs to marinate, and maybe this is a sign that we're getting close to dinner, because I'm making another food analogy. But sometimes you kind of let things simmer until they're just right.
Mm. Yeah, no, I agree. And to round out the episode, I'll just say again, I think this is something that we've both mentioned a little bit throughout. I don't think, like, I always use the Hawks example with Trae Young and DeJounte Murray. That's a pairing where pretty quickly you realize it wasn't going to work. That hasn't been the case with the Cavs. There's stuff here that they can work on. If they choose to move on this summer, I think there's arguments to be made for it, but this isn't the doomsday DEFCON level 5 or 1, whatever the highest one is. They're not like the midnight, the clock has not reached midnight yet. And so I'm really excited to see what they choose to do this summer. That's all for today's episode of What's Next. I want to thank Justin once again for joining me. Special thank you to everyone who watches or listens to the pod. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider hitting subscribe and dropping a like. And you can find Justin and the Chasedown pod on the official Cleveland Cavaliers YouTube page. I will have links in the description, so please check it out if you somehow already haven't. Justin does great stuff over there, him and Carter. And with all that being said, go Cavs.